All right, well, good evening, guys. We had a few technical difficulties there that we finally got over. Appreciate the patience. If you guys want to share a link out in the Slack channel, in the general channel, we put the actual YouTube broadcast link for the current broadcast. We accidentally shut the old one down doing some testing with it. My name is Seth Webster, and I'm with Laravel DFW. I want to welcome you artisans to the Meetup, all you guys that are local, as well as you guys who are watching the live stream, and to you guys who are watching the video later. We are really excited about the presentation that we're going to have tonight. But first, some housekeeping items. We are Laravel DFW, and we are online at Twitter at laraveldfw.com. We have a Slack channel. We'll be throwing some slides up here for you. We have a Slack channel that we encourage you to join. If you go to laraveldfw.com/Slack, then what you can do is fill out a type form invitation there, send us your email address, and we'll get you invited into Slack. You can join the conversations that we've got going on there. Anything you want health-wise, any opportunities going on for Laravel developers here in the DFW Metroplex. We do a lot of updates about these meetups that we do, as well as other goings-ons around there. And then other conversations that come in and out of there. A lot of great resources to get help, a lot of great developers that we have in there. As always, you can use the Meetup group as well. Communication going on in there. We have over 100 artisans that are part of the Meetup group. We thank every single one of you for participating in that with us. And there's also great resources there. So message those guys, have conversations. This is a place where we want to bring artisans together to learn Laravel, get better at it, and really hone our skills. So to that point, tonight we have a presentation by Ben Kuhl, who is a developer with RealPage. RealPage does a number of multifamily property stuff, and I'll let Ben Kuhl give you guys the details on that. The talk tonight is going to be Jumpstarting Lumen. They use Lumen heavily in their environment. He'll talk in detail about that. And they've used some tools and set up some items that they use, repos that help them to get moving forward with Lumen as a service quickly and efficiently. And that's the talk that we're going to have tonight. So very excited to hear that. And without further ado, we're going to hand this over to Ben and let him get started with this presentation.
Thank you, Seth. I appreciate that. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, we're good.
Okay, excellent. I appreciate that. You know, Seth kind of gave me a tour of the space, and you know, the pool table, the ping pong. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, I think so. We just need to make sure it's going through the main computer that's broadcasting.
Okay. Can we?
Technology. Hey, we're developers, not directors.
Oh, okay, there we go.
Okay, looks like we got audio through the broadcast, so go ahead, Ben.
Okay, so we're all good. Okay.
It was fine before. Kill that. Okay. Gotcha. All right.
Are we good now?
Go ahead, Ben.
Sorry, I think I was talking the same thing. We're all set?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Seth, I appreciate the introduction, and you know, honestly, I'm pretty jealous I'm not actually there tonight because the space looks awesome. You know, the pool table, ping pong, and the whole kitchen back there. It really just makes me jealous I wasn't there. So again, I appreciate you guys letting me speak tonight. So tonight I'm going to talk about Jumpstarting Lumen, and there's a lot of tech that is open source that developers can pick from. There's several dozen different ways to implement permissions, several dozen different ways to test your application, and I'm going to talk about some of the tech that we've used, or that we are using, and why we're using that. So I'll reference my slides now. So my name is Ben Kuhl, and I've been creating bugs for about 14 years. I am self-taught, which I guess makes me a professional Googler. at this point. Any developer who doesn't spend a lot of time on Google, they're missing out. I've also spent a lot of time in Laravel and have some extensive experience. I created the dispatcher package that was the original concept behind the Laravel 5 scheduling. It used to be a separate package, and now it's with Laravel 5 it was brought into the framework. And like Seth mentioned, I work at RealPage. RealPage actually acquired the company that I worked for in Louisville, Kentucky, known as Indadus. And we did a lot of open source and stuff like that. So when they acquired us, it was just natural to continue in the open source space. RealPage is a publicly traded company, so small problems became big problems. Instead of one team having that problem, 7 teams have that problem. And so tonight I'm going to talk a little more about how that tooling helps us out. So let's get to the point. When you guys start a new Lumen project, there's a whole lot of stuff that needs to be considered. There's a whole lot of tooling that you need. Developers want things like standards, PSR2 for code formatting, auto-loading, JSON API spec. There's all different types of standards that can go into application design. Things like automated testing. We want continuous integration. We want to know that we can merge code into the master branch, trigger a deployment, and everything's fine, and go to lunch. We need API documentation. An API is no good if people don't know how to use it. I already mentioned continuous integration, and of course, deployment workflow. So that whole notion of how does code get promoted to staging? How does it get deployed? What's that deployment process look like? Lumen apps can be pretty complicated, so there's a lot of moving parts, and you definitely don't want to break anything. The list just goes on and on. For us at RealPage, we've kind of solved that by developing some starter repos. I mentioned that any problem that we have, any need that we have, like API documentation and such, now instead of 1 or 2 teams working on that, with RealPage doing more and more with Laravel and with Lumen, those problems and those roadblocks, we want to avoid the scenario where 4 teams are trying to figure out how to document their APIs. And then we have 4 different ways of doing that. And maybe they've used different tools and they're in different locations. And standardization there is key. And so using these starter repos, we've kind of solved some of these problems. So when we start a new project, we copy the starter repo as an initial commit in a new repository. So the first key thing that we've included is, of course, Lumen, but the second key thing is local development. And it's key for our deployment feature that everything we do moving forward is using Docker. So when a developer checks out the starter repo, or they check out their project for the first time, it's packaged with a Docker Compose configuration running PHP 7 and Postgres. Now, we use Postgres because that's the database standard we've chosen within RealPage. There is in the FAQ in the repository instructions on how to switch that over to MySQL, because we recognize that that's not going to be the right tool for the job for everybody. So this means that because we're using Docker, the only dependency is a developer has to have Docker installed on their machine. But every project that uses Laravel or Lumen is based on Docker. So once a developer clones the repo, they compose or install, and then run Docker Compose up to build their local environment, and they're all set. Currently, we're using Debbie and Jesse in our images, so if you choose to use this, expect that. But we're working on switching to Alpine. It's a more lightweight distro and does things that are more optimized for Docker itself. Now, some of you are probably not familiar with Docker. It's different than a VM. The idea behind a container is it doesn't change. It's immutable. So when I build so in the example file there, I've got in the services section, there's an FPM container. You can see that it references a local Docker file. The environment file, it's pulling my local environment configuration, and then it mounts the application in a volume. So that FPM container has Jesse on it and FPM, and that's it. Nothing else. It does not have Nginx. It does not have anything else. The web service, or the web container, is what actually serves the app via Nginx. And there's several different volumes we mount there, and that's also where the Nginx config is included. The whole idea behind Docker deployments is the different services in your application they're single processes. And so FPM is a single process. Nginx is a single process. We don't put those on the same container. Now, for us as an enterprise, that's important for scalability because it allows us to say, we need 10 instances of Nginx to service our application, but we really only need 5 FPM containers. And when you get beyond FPM and you get beyond Nginx and you start talking about how to scale queue workers and things like that on an enterprise scale, for us, the single process approach gives us the ability to scale those services independently. So all of this is included out of the box. Developers don't need to customize this. We've done all the hard work for you. So if you want to get started using Docker, this is a great way to dive in because you're already ready to go. So a next big thing is the continuous integration, continuous deployment workflow, because we all want to just be able to merge code and go to lunch and know that it's going to deploy to production, staging, whatever the next step in the process is. And so there's a couple key things we've done with this project. One, we're using Travis. It's very, very known in the open source community. It's one of the most common CIs, and because they offer free integration for open source projects, it made sense for us. So we have a Travis configuration already in the repository that handles running tests, that handles checking PSR2, and some other things we're going to talk about with testing here in a minute. So Travis integration is there out of the box. And this is kind of a diagram of the workflow that Travis offers. So our intended workflow for our teams within RealPage, and of course this can be customized for any project, however you'd like, is a developer builds something cool on a feature branch. They push up, create a pull request to dev. At the point at which they have a pull request open for dev, CI takes over. It builds the Docker containers. It runs unit functional and API tests and checks the application for coding standards. So things like PSR2 and also JSON API spec. At that point, the code has to be merged, go through that code review process. Another developer looks at it for knowledge sharing and all of that kind of good stuff that comes from code reviews. But once another developer approves it, then it gets merged into the dev branch. And at that point, again, our Travis configuration out of the box is designed to only promote code to an actual hosted environment and off the staging and master branch. So when we take dev and we merge to staging, that build's going to run in CI again. But after the build runs, assuming everything passed, it's going to push those Docker containers that the application was tested in up to Docker Hub. And so that gives us our deployable containers. So because we're using Docker, we're not using the PHP version that's in Travis. We're using the PHP that's actually in our Docker containers. So that's actually the PHP version that is going to be run in the staging environment. And likewise, in the case of the master branch, in the production environment. I don't want to go too deep into Docker because, frankly, we could spend hours talking about that. So if you're really curious about that, I highly recommend you check it out. But the big takeaway from Docker is it's immutable. Instead of deploying your app to your infrastructure is part of your application. Things like FPM, Nginx, and updating those components are as simple as deploying a new container on your application, deploying the next build. And so we use Docker Hub to store those containers, and we use Rancher to manage our production environment, really all of our environments. We've looked at some other Docker tooling, things like Docker Data Center and Docker UCP and some other orchestration tooling for Docker containers in production in different environments. We highly, highly, highly recommend Rancher. They have a fantastic API. It's open source and free, so you could go home today and get it up and running in probably less than 5 minutes. Rancher itself is deployed in a Docker container. So just run the container and you're set. So this gives you a kind of overview of the intended workflow behind the starters. Again, this is customizable, so it can be changed. This can definitely serve as more of a baseline. So automated testing is key. Our objective is continuous deployments. And so the key with continuous deployments is to look at the testing of your application and ask yourself, what level of testing do we need to have to know that this thing works or to know that this thing is broken? PHP Unit does a great job at unit tests, functional test, and acceptance test. The Laravel helpers do a great job at that acceptance portion. And we're going to dig into that a little bit more. We've also included Dredd in this project. And Dredd is a fantastic tool. It serves as an acceptance tester, but it also tests your API documentation. So you know when your API documentation is incorrect. And we're going to talk about that more in a second. So let's start with PHP Unit. Chances are you've used it. If not, awesome. This is a great opportunity to dive into something new. PHP Unit is, people first think like I'm going to use it as a unit testing framework, and it's great at that. Here's a basic test example that I'm passing some data to an object and running an assertion on the output of one of my methods. So it's standard input-output unit testing. We highly recommend mockery to mock objects, and the concept behind a mock is, say you're unit testing something that sends an email. Well, you don't actually want to send that email. So Laravel has helpers that you could do like, of course I don't have a slide for this, that visual would help, but you can assert that the application tried to send an email without actually sending it. And so mockery is a great library to do that with things very specific to your application. A way of saying, give me something that looks like this object that'll pass the type hint check without actually giving you an object that is that thing. And it's got like 50 assertion methods. Laravel expands on the assertion that it does out of the box with their test helpers that are described in their in the Laravel docs and the Lumen docs. But it's got a lot out of the box. So I mentioned Laravel's acceptance testing, and here's a great example of an acceptance test. I'm acting as a user, so I don't have to worry about auth. Laravel handles that under the cover. I'm going to simulate a post request with the name Sally and see that the JSON response contains that the entity was actually created. So in this case, I'm simulating requests as a user, which handles the auth. PHP Unit has a ton of assertion methods, and again, those Laravel helpers. There's things like CJSON equals, CJSON structure, C in database. These are things that are API specific that are not in Laravel as much, that are more specific to Lumen. And it's important to note this doesn't actually make a curl request on the application. So you don't have to have Nginx running. You don't have to have a web server running in order to run this. All you need is the PHP command line client. That can be good in a lot of cases because it's faster, but depending on the type of test you're running and the level of testing you want to have on your application, you may want to go a step further, which is where Dredd helps out. So functional testing is one thing that, when it comes to Lumen and PHP Unit specifically, it's not something a lot of people know you can do with it. So this is a ugly example given. It's the best one I have at the moment. But so this is from an application I worked on a year and a half ago. And the idea behind the application is within the domain, customers can import contacts. So they take a CSV, they can import that, but they can do it to a list several times. So there's this notion of they're updating their content through uploading files. Well, you may want to test, so we have a test in Codeception in this case that tests the UI, that goes through the actions as the user, clicks on the file upload, option, selects the file, asserts that the success message was viewed, and so on. But PHP unit can do a lot more than that. In this case, with something like merging contacts and when they're deleted, when information is updated, there's a lot of decisions being made within the application. And we really wanted to harness PHP unit to build functional tests so that those tests remain fast and we're not testing the UI more than we need to. And so this is an example of how a functional test can be written. We're creating two lists, and we're creating to import jobs based on two files that we've pre-created, and then we're running assertions on the output to make sure that this contact still lists on, like, both of these contacts were merged after this is completed. Testing can also be used as a form of documentation. I know I'm kind of going off on a tangent on testing. I'm going to go back after this, but you don't want to retest what's already been tested. So the value added by functional tests is when you're not testing the UI and things are running fast, you can create different types of tests very quickly for the domain of your application, and they can serve as a great form of documentation if they describe the behavior. So in this case here, here's a couple of tests we've written. Can import the same contact to multiple lists. I'm sure you can guess what that's actually testing. Can import a contact with extra data attributes. Can update additional contact attributes via importing. And so all three of those things are in addition to a test we have on the UI. I bring this up because it separates testing the domain of our application from the Laravel or Lumen components. And so it gives us the ability to focus on the domain of the application and encourage encourage you guys to use PHP unit to build those domain level tests. So API documentation tests. Let's dive into Dredd and API Blueprint a little bit. So we looked at things like Swagger, which is common in the Java world, very commonly used, and there's a lot of tooling built around that. And we looked at another tool called API Blueprint, and this is a spec for writing API documentation in Markdown. And so here's an example of how you can. So here's an example of data structures written in API Blueprint. It's very lightweight. This keeps the code clean because there's not comments all throughout the application. One thing we talked about when we were looking at API tooling is when you use PHP doc blocks within your application and you have two different versions of your API within the same application, you may have docs that vary depending on, so if you have like a version 1 and a version 2 being served by the same application, you may have two auth controllers with slightly different documentation, but also with commonalities. So maybe your user auth is email excuse me, user auth is a bad example. But maybe there's slight differences between the two APIs. By pulling that out and putting that in Markdown files, you can feel free to structure your code freely without worrying about, am I duplicating documentation? How am I going to keep the source of truth with this documentation in one place, but properly add my docs in both places? So you can define data structures, and then you can also define requests and responses. And this is very clean. We were big fans of this, and there's a lot of tooling built around API Blueprint as well. So Dredd itself is a tool that parses API Blueprint and then submits curl requests based on the documentation and performs assertions on the API responses. So here's an example of the starter test running in Travis CI and what that output looks like. So it'll go through the API docs, it'll parse all of that, build that curl request, and actually hit the application. And that requires a running instance of Nginx. It requires the application is fully operational. But since we're also using Docker Compose within the CI environment, we have a running copy of the application. We have Nginx. We have FPM. So what that enables us to do is if we want to upgrade Nginx, all we have to do is upgrade the Docker file, and then let CI run the tests, and we're done. Or run the test locally, and we're done, because we're actually hitting the running version of the application through Nginx. So we also, because we use API blueprinting, I mentioned there was a lot of tooling around that. There's also API documentation generators, and out of the box, we with the starter repo generate Aglio textual documentation based on those API blueprint markdown files. There's several themes included. I've included 2 of the white ones here. There's also dark themes and 2-column versus 3-column, and you can also build your own theme and fork existing themes and all that kind of stuff you'd want to do. Developers are very picky, so we like things the way we like them, and this gives us the opportunity to do that how we want. There's also the ability to include markdown files and inside of other markdown files and have them still generated as documentation. So you can structure your markdown files however you would like, and then Aglio will still pull all those in together and generate your documentation. There's also live reloading when editing, which is very, very useful, because especially when you get new with something and you're not sure if you're doing the markdown right, or if your nesting level is off, or something like that, that can be really useful. This documentation is generated in CI and included in the Nginx Docker container for this. So out of the box, you don't have to set anything up. Just start writing your documentation, and whenever you deploy, it'll be there. So for deployments, I mentioned earlier we do the single process containers, and here's a visual example of how that works, how that looks. We use Rancher, as I mentioned. This is the Lumen starter service deployed in Rancher. This is our production environment for that. So let's go down the list here of services. So we have a DB service first on the list. It's running Postgres 9.6. We have an FPM service, which is running a real page Lumen starter image, FPM, and then we also include a commit hash, part of the commit hash, and a timestamp. So that gives us a little information about what version of the application is deployed. Now in Lumen you have migrations, right? So you need to be able to run those migrations when your application is deployed. Well, the container infrastructure we have in place in the starter repo, we have a solution for that. And we build an FPM container, we build an Nginx container, and we build a CLI container. And the CLI container has everything needed to run Lumen from the command line. So things like migrations, things like for your staging environment, migrate, refresh, seed. And really anything else you need, queue workers, anything else that needs to be run in the CLI environment. So migrations here we have slotted as a run once container. That means it doesn't have a running process. It's just like, this is just running PHP artisan migrate, done. So it's not a continually running process. That's why it's flagged as started once over on the left side. And so we recognize deploying an application in this kind of environment can be challenging. And so also included in the repo, we have Rancher has its own, it has its own version of config files that allow you to define your architecture with how it is within Rancher. So essentially what that allows you to do is take the example files we've included in the repo and import them directly into Rancher, and you've got the infrastructure we're looking at here. And all of your containers are running your application, everything's there. And then you can use the UI to modify that and upgrade containers. So yeah. So that's a quick overview of the tech included in the starter repo. I want to give everybody a chance to ask questions or any. ask questions either about the repo itself or how we've solved things here. The starter projects are open source, github.com/real page. There's one for Lumen and Laravel. We just went through a lot of the tech included in Lumen. Laravel doesn't have as much tech because you don't need things like API documentation and Dredd and some other things like that we've talked about. So it's a little bit more lightweight than the Lumen from a needs perspective. So I'll turn it back over to Seth. One thing I do want to make sure I mention is Laravel developers, PHP developers working on Laravel and Lumen at RealPage use this kind of tech every day. So we have teams that we're building out in the Dallas area and in Louisville. And if anybody's interested in learning more about what we're doing and kind of where we're headed, by all means, feel free to reach out to me via email or on Twitter. And I'd be happy to talk with you and get you connected with some other people.
Hey, Ben.
Yes.
You'll need to switch to the feed that's showing the access channel to be able to hear the questions that we're asking through the mic feed.
Okay.
Because we had one question, I just want to make sure you're going to hear it.
Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, I didn't hear that.
No problem. We're going to try it again.
So I need to switch to the other Hangout?
No. Stay on this Hangout, but switch to the user that's named Dave Developer.
Okay.
That participant. We've got a feed going through there, and you should be able to hear it. So
okay,
let me know if you don't hear anything in like 2 seconds.
That user's muted at the moment.
Do anything? How do I unmute you?
If you click on the portrait in the bottom right, a menu should pop up.
Okay. You can hear us now?
Yes.
Okay. We're going to bring that question up again.
In moving from a Meetup environment to a Docker environment, is there a certain size that you would want to hit before you did that, or are there enough advantages to the Docker environment for a 1, 2, 3 person
Sorry, I got some feedback there, and I wasn't able to hear the full question. Can you repeat it?
The question comes down to, again, Docker, I can understand the point of Docker in a larger environment, but if you've got smaller applications, smaller team, are there good reasons to go through the learning curve to move from VM to Docker?
I would say absolutely. I think moving forward, because it couples your application to the infrastructure, upgrades become easy. If you've ever been in the scenario, like Docker's not just a solution for local development, it's a solution for local to production and being consistent from start to finish. And so, an application deployment could be a new feature to your application, or it could be you're just upgrading PHP. You ran all your tests and you're upgrading. If you have if you currently deploy your application to a server that's running PHP and use tooling like Capistrano or Rocketeer or things of that nature that you're pushing your application to your server, it's more than likely you've run into that scenario of oops, the file permissions changed, or there's this dependency, this PHP dependency that doesn't exist on production, and we thought somebody configured that correctly. Those kind of scenarios don't exist with Docker because you're replacing the Linux environment, the PHP environment. All of that is part of the deployment. And I think as developers moving forward, that is just going to get easier and easier. So, right now it's kind of rough around the edges. There's a Docker Mac client and a Docker PC client that they've just, I think it went into open beta last week. And it's a beta, so there might be issues with it. But I think moving forward long term, it's definitely in every developer's best interest to explore it.
And I think I'd just add to that, the point of using VMs right now is in order to attempt to recreate your stage or your production environment for a developer. What Ben's speaking to is you basically remove all the parity in that. You're not recreating the environment. You are developing in the actual environment, and that entire container gets shipped to where now it's publicly accessible, scalable in that manner. So it's just literally the exact same app, not a close approximation of it. There is a curve there in figuring that out to work in your environment. I'm wondering, Ben, do you guys have any documentation that RealPage puts out that speaks, to maybe how you scale Docker containers? I know there's still some security questions out there of Docker in production that speak to any of that kind of information that we'd be able to get some access to.
We don't have anything that we put out specifically. We are big fans of Rancher. They've been critical for our team because they also do a monthly meetup, and they publish the videos available, and they walk through tooling around Rancher and tooling around Docker and Rancher in particular as well. Yeah, we don't have anything that we publish, but I would highly recommend checking out Rancher because for us at the scale at RealPage, the enterprise level, everything's got to be automated. It's got to be reliable. But so we have the teams to be able to build automating tooling around the stuff we're using. So things like Rancher. But Rancher does give you the ability, a nice clean UI, to scale Docker and to handle those deployments and transparency into what's happening without having to know all those commands that you need to be able to know, and kind of helps you focus on deploying your application, and less of, oh, there's so many command line options for this utility. I hope I do it right and don't mess up production.
Okay. Any other questions here? No? All right, Twitter, I haven't seen anything come through. Nathan, you seen anything come through?
Nope.
Tanner must not be watching us remotely. Otherwise, I'm sure he'd feel obligated to ask a question.
Yes.
Well, Ben, it's fantastic. Oh, here we go. We do have one. Let me take the mic that way. Hope we don't get feedback.
Yeah, I just had a question about, have you looked at other things that Dredd can interface with as opposed to just API Blueprint?
I believe Dredd, I'm not sure if it can interface with other things. I'm sure there's a adapter pattern built into its core to where it wouldn't be too difficult to make it integrate with other things. Like if you wanted to expand on that with Swagger. For us, we went the route of Dredd looks awesome. They recommend API Blueprint. We looked at API Blueprint, compared that to Swagger, and decided on API Blueprint. So As far as other integrations, I don't really know. That wasn't as much of a question that we asked when we were putting all this together.
Okay. Anything else?
I didn't catch what the repo is.
Ben, you want to go ahead and where the repo is? It's github.com/realpage, singular, and that's where their Lumen starter is, Laravel starter, and they have some other great repos in there. Yeah, poke through a little bit, Ben, to see what you guys.
Yes.
So why don't we take an opportunity to tell us a little bit about RealPage, what you guys actually do there. Now we can see a little bit of the tech that you're using and how you're going about it. Tell us what you've got going on, and then if you guys have any opportunities available or things that you're currently looking for, and then we can work to get anybody interested in something that you guys might have connected with your team.
Cool. So RealPage is a publicly traded company and focuses on software that services the multifamily housing industry. Software that is kind of like, gosh, there's so much. A tool that we work on in Louisville is a emergency message handling solution, and the whole idea is we sell it to apartment complexes, condominiums, and things like that, and they port their phone number to us. And when someone calls, they press 1 to leave an emergency message, and we route that phone call to a technician. That technician listens to the message. We're tracking metrics on all of that and the performance of the technician and his response time to get on site to a maintenance emergency. We have a broad range of tools that cover everything from leasing to developing communities around, like within apartment complexes and other multifamily housing. And so historically, like the past 5 or 6 years, RealPage they've been a company that does a lot of acquisitions. And so this product looks cool, let's buy them, and then we can integrate that over here. And so there's been a lot of that. I formerly worked at Indadis in Louisville, Kentucky, and we were RealPage's 60th acquisition, to give you some idea. So there's a lot of tech in a lot of different languages scattered all throughout the company. And so right now there's an initiative to step back and say, okay, we've got 7 apps that integrate with Twilio. We've got 6 apps that integrate with Mandrill, 2 with SendGrid, and like we're duplicating a lot of work all over the place. And so the approach we're taking moving forward is using Laravel and Lumen. We want to step back and we want to build enterprise microservices that can service those applications. So we have a Lumen app that handles sending email, and that's the enterprise service, so every app integrates with that service. And we're going to be using Laravel to handle some of the front-end application stuff. And so that's why we maintain a Laravel starter and a Lumen starter. There's a team in California right now, team in Louisville, team in Dallas. And these teams are dedicated to Lumen, Laravel, test coverage, the whole culture that goes along with the Joel test. We pass all of that and want to remain passing that. And so if you live in those areas or you're interested in relocating to those areas, definitely reach out to me, Ben Kuhl, BenKuhl, @gmail.com, and I can get the ball rolling on that and get you some information and on what the opportunities are.
All right. Well, we really appreciate it. That was a great presentation. Would you be able to make those slides available if they aren't already there?
Absolutely. They're not available. I'll post them on the Meetup site.
Okay.
Does that work?
That's a good starting point. I'd love to invite you to our Laravel DFW Slack channel. Just go to laraveldfw.com. This is for anybody else watching as well, or if you're here and have not gone yet. laraveldfw.com/Slack. Send us your email address. We'll get you an invite pretty quick. I think I even gave somebody access to Slack at like 3 o'clock in the morning. So go hit it up. We'll get you the invite. I'm going to call you out, Ben, tell you to go join us there and drop your link to your slides in there. It'd be fantastic.
All right. Thanks a lot. We'll do.
All right. Well, that's going to conclude our meetup for tonight. You guys that are here at Access are free to hang out, mingle, do whatever. We'll let you get back to your regular life being cool. And don't forget, it's be cool or else on Twitter, and then bencool@gmail.com. All right. So thanks to Access so much for letting us use this location. Thanks for watching us live, and if you're watching this after the fact, we appreciate you bringing us the views. Feel free to add comments in the YouTube channel, give us feedback. Any questions you may have for Ben, feel free to kick them to us in Slack. We're on the YouTube broadcast, and we'll try and see if we can't field them with Ben and get you some answers after the fact. Everybody have a great night. See you next month.